The briefing room smelled faintly of old coffee, gun oil, and dust. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale glare on the scarred oak table in the center of the room. Around it, officers and sergeants sat waiting, their uniforms crisp, their eyes restless from too many deployments and not enough sleep. Maps were pinned to the walls, lines and markings scrolled across them in red, tracing valleys, roads, and the skeletal outlines of villages half a world away. The war lived. Here, in ink and paper, before it erupted into reality. When she entered the room, the atmosphere shifted. Not abruptly, but in a subtle ripple, like wind brushing the surface of water. She carried her rifle case as if it weighed nothing, though everyone knew what was inside. The Barrett .50 caliber was not a weapon for the faint-hearted. At nearly 30 pounds, it was less a rifle than a steel monster designed to shatter armor, puncture walls, and silence enemies from miles away. Men twice her size had struggled under its weight. And yet, she carried it without visible strain, her posture steady, her boots striking the floor with unshaken rhythm. The colonel noticed her immediately. He was a broad-shouldered man with silver hair clipped close to the scalp, a face lined by years of command, and eyes sharpened by skepticism. He had seen countless soldiers walk into rooms like this, each trying to prove they belonged. But when his gaze settled on her slight, lean, young enough to still carry the softness of youth in her cheeks, his lips curled into a smirk. "That cannon's bigger than you," he remarked, his voice carrying across the room. His chuckle broke the stillness, drawing a few stifled laughs from others at the table. The sound was not cruel, not yet. It was the kind of laugh born from disbelief, a dismissal hidden in humor. To the colonel, it seemed absurd a young woman, barely 5.5 feet tall, daring to tame a weapon that punished even seasoned sharpshooters. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms with the air of a man already certain of the conclusion. This was not malice, he told himself. It was realism. War was unforgiving, and illusions of strength could cost lives. She did not flinch. Her eyes clear, steady. The color of winter steel met his with calmness. She set the case down with a soft thud, the latches clicking open under her hands. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted the rifle free, resting it against her shoulder with practiced ease. The room went quiet, laughter tapering into silence. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The colonel tilted his head, still smirking, though a flicker of curiosity edged into his gaze. He had expected nervous fumbling, the clumsy arrogance of youth. Instead, he saw deliberate movements, measured like clockwork, as though the rifle wasn't an object to her, but an extension of her body. Around the table, whispers began. A sergeant muttered something about rookies trying to show off, while another officer murmured about the weapon's recoil, snapping bones. Yet the longer they watched her, the more their words faded into uncertainty. The colonel cleared his throat, pushing his chair back. "You understand what you're dealing with, don't you?" His tone carried the weight of command. "That rifle isn't for show. It's not a toy. Men twice your size have walked away with bruises after a single round. What makes you think you can handle it?" The words hung in the air, sharp, almost accusatory. She straightened, her hands resting lightly on the weapon. Her answer was simple, spoken without hesitation. "Because I already have, sir." The colonel's smile froze. A murmur rippled through the room. Her voice was steady, not defensive, not boastful, just a statement of fact. It carried none of the nervous quiver of a rookie trying to impress. Instead, it carried the weight of someone who had walked through doubt many times before and no longer cared to explain herself. The colonel studied her, narrowing his eyes. Training is one thing. Combat is another. Targets don't shoot back. Again, she didn't flinch, then let them try. For a moment, silence reclaimed the room. The colonel exhaled through his nose, shaking his head as though amused. His laughter returned, softer this time, tinged with disbelief rather than mockery. He leaned back in his chair again, but something in his posture had shifted. He had expected fear, perhaps bravado. What he had received instead was something rarer, calm certainty. Still, he was unconvinced. He had seen too many soldiers broken by the weight of expectation. "We'll see," he muttered finally, almost to himself. "The field will decide." She said nothing more. She knew the colonel's doubt wasn't new. She had heard it before, in training grounds, in whispered conversations between peers, in the raised eyebrows of instructors who measured her frame against the weapons she carried. Doubt had been her shadow since the first time she'd lifted a rifle, but shadows didn't scare her. They only sharpened her focus. As the briefing began, the colonel's words faded into the drone of orders and maps. But she was elsewhere, in memory, in silence, in the wide-open fields of Montana, where her journey had begun. It was there, as a child, that she first learned. The truth the colonel couldn't see: strength was not always measured in size, but in patience. And patience was something she had cultivated all her life. The laughter in the room hadn't wounded her. It had only reminded her of the long path that had led her here. A path the colonel would one day understand, though not yet. Not until he saw what she could do with the rifle he had mocked. Not until the day her name would be whispered across bases, carried not on laughter, but on respect. The plains of Montana stretched out like a never-ending sea, golden grasses rolling in waves beneath the sweep of the wind. Out there, under skies so wide they seemed to swallow the world, silence carried a different weight. It wasn't empty. Silence. It was alive, filled with the rustle of grass, the distant calls of hawks, the soft creak of wood as a ranch house settled into the cold morning air. This was where she grew up. The land raised her as much as her family did. There were no city streets to shape her, no constant traffic or noise. Her companions were the quiet strength of the earth, the rhythm of work on the ranch, and the sharp lessons of survival. Out here, patience wasn't just a virtue. It was the key to life. Cattle needed tending in the biting winters. Coyotes prowled in the shadows. And hunting wasn't sport, it was necessity. Her father was the first to put a rifle in her hands. He was a tall man, weathered by sun and storms, his face rough with lines carved by wind and time. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried the same gravity as the land around them. On her 12th birthday, he handed her a rifle not as a gift, but as an inheritance. "You don't own this," he told her, his voice low. "You respect it. You learn it. You let it teach you." The rifle was heavy in her hands, far heavier than anything she had carried before. Her small fingers curled around the stock, her cheek pressed against the worn wood as she squinted down the cognate. Sights. The target wasn't a bullseye painted on paper, but a tin cassette on a fence post 200 yards away. Her first shot rang out into the morning, a sharp crack that startled a flock of birds into the sky. The can stayed where it was. She lowered the rifle, cheeks burning, but her father didn't scold her. He just adjusted her grip, nudged her shoulder into the stock, and said, "You rushed. Don't chase the shot. Let it come to you." So she tried again and again. For days, weeks, months, she practiced. Some days the can toppled. Some days it didn't. But her father's voice was steady in her ear. "Breathe with the earth. Patience, not pressure." Slowly, she began to understand. Shooting wasn't about strength. It wasn't about speed. It was about stillness. About listening to the wind, to the rhythm of her own heartbeat, to the subtle pull of the earth beneath her boots. By the time she was 15, She could split a bottle cap at 500 yards. Not every time, not perfectly, but often enough that her father would nod once, quietly, and let her see the pride in his eyes before returning to work. Those fields became her classroom, her laboratory. She learned to watch the grasses bend to the wind, to smell rain before it fell, to hear the faint crack of ice forming on the creek before dawn. The land taught her that nothing was ever still, and yet, within that constant movement, there was always a pattern waiting to be found. It wasn't only her father who shaped her. Her mother, though gentler in manner, was equally firm in her lessons. From her, she learned endurance, how to work through pain, how to finish tasks even when every muscle screamed for rest. On the ranch, there was no luxury of quitting. Fences needed mending whether hands were blistered or not. Animals needed feeding, whether the wind cut through bone or the sun scorched skin. Quitting wasn't an option. That endurance would become as valuable to her as her precision. Yet outside her family, few understood. When classmates asked what she did on weekends, she told them about hunting or working cattle. Their blank stares, or worse, their laughter, didn't bother her. She had long since learned that other people's understanding wasn't necessary for her to thrive. One winter, when the snow piled high and the nights stretched long, her father took her farther than ever before, deep into the timber, where elk tracks wound through the drifts. The cold bit at her cheeks, her breath crystallized in the air, but she stayed close, rifle slung over her shoulder. Hours passed without a single sound but the crunch of their boots. Finally, they stopped on a ridge. Below, in the valley, a bull elk grazed, massive and unaware. Her father crouched, pointing to it. "This is patience," he whispered. "We've waited all morning. If you rush, you'll miss. If you don't take it, we go hungry." She nodded, lowering herself into the snow, steadying the rifle. Her heart hammered in her chest. The distance stretched farther than she had ever attempted. She adjusted her breathing, focusing not on the shot, but on the rhythm of her inhale, the slow exhale. The world narrowed to the crosshairs, the wind. Against her cheek, the faint movement of the elk's chest as it breathed. When she pulled the trigger, the shot cracked like thunder. The elk staggered, then dropped. Silence returned, heavy and absolute. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, firm and approving. "Now you understand." She did. That day wasn't about killing an animal. It was about trust. Trusting herself, her patience, and the lessons the land had taught her. Years later, when she stood in military training fields thousands of miles from home, those lessons would echo in her mind. While others panicked at missed shots, she remembered the long mornings on the ridge. While instructors barked orders, she thought of her father's quiet voice. "Don't chase the shot. Let it come to you." What none of them, neither her instructors, nor her peers, nor the colonel himself could see, was that she had already been shaped by an environment harsher and more demanding than any training ground. Montana had given her silence. Silence that taught her how to listen. Silence that taught her how to wait. And that silence would become her greatest weapon. The colonel might laugh at the sight of her with the Barrett, but he didn't know the truth yet. He didn't know that every step she took into the military was just a continuation of a path that had begun on a ranch beneath the endless Montana sky, and that path, steady and unwavering, was leading her straight toward a destiny that no laughter could deny. The first day of sniper school began before dawn. A low, gray fog clung to the training grounds, curling between the barracks and the firing range like smoke from an unseen fire. Soldiers shuffled into formation, their boots crunching over gravel, their faces hardened into masks of determination or dread. She stood among them, rifle slung over her shoulder, her expression calm, unreadable. Around her, Whispers buzzed like gnats. They weren't loud enough to draw an instructor's attention, but she heard them all the same. She won't last. A week. Barrett'll break her shoulder clean off. Must have pulled strings to get in here. She ignored them. Words couldn't bruise her anymore. They hadn't been able to for years. But she filed them away, each one a quiet ember she would burn into fuel. The instructors barked orders, sending the recruits through punishing drills. Long-distance runs in full gear, push-ups until muscles screamed, endless hours of weapons. Maintenance. It wasn't just about shooting. It was about endurance, precision under pressure, and the mental steel to stay focused when exhaustion gnawed at every nerve. Some recruits cracked in days. Others held out longer, only to falter. When the pressure mounted, she didn't crack. She didn't falter. She endured. When the sun rose, she was running. When it set, she was still on her feet. While others cursed the weight of their gear, she bore it silently, as though the ranch work of her childhood had been preparing her for this very moment. The land had already hardened her in ways no training course could replicate. But endurance wasn't enough. Not here. Here, the rifle ruled. The first live fire session was almost ceremonial. The instructors set up steel targets at increasing distances, 300, 500, 800, and finally 1,000 yards. Each recruit would fire in turn, the crack of rifles echoing across the open field, followed by the metallic ping of bullets striking steel, or, in many cases, the hollow silence of a miss. She waited her turn, lying prone in the grass, eyes fixed on the horizon. Her Barrett lay before her, massive and intimidating to those who didn't know its rhythm. She did. To her, the weapon was no monster. It was simply another voice in the abyss. Silence, one she had long since learned to listen to. When her name was called, she stepped forward, dropped into position, and adjusted her scope. The whispers rose again. Bet she misses. Watch her get knocked back. The instructor gave the command. She steadied her breathing, adjusted for wind, and squeezed the trigger. A shot thundered across the range, the recoil slamming into her shoulder. She absorbed it without a flinch, letting the power roll through her body like a wave. A heartbeat. Later, the steel plate at 500 yards rang with a clean, sharp ping. The whispers faltered. She fired again. Another ping. And again. Ping. When she reached 1,000 yards, the world seemed to hold its breath. Through her scope, the steel target shimmered in the heat. She adjusted for drop, for the faint breeze tugging left across the range, and fired. Ping. The sound rang out like a verdict. She rose smoothly, slinging the rifle back over her shoulder. The whispers were gone. Not respect yet, it would take longer, but silence, and silence was the first victory. The instructors noticed too. One of them, a grizzled veteran with scars puckering his jaw, scribbled a note on his clipboard, his eyes never leaving her. Another leaned close to the colonel, muttering something that made the older man grunt in reluctant acknowledgement. But the colonel himself? He still wasn't convinced. Paper targets don't shoot back, he reminded her later, echoing the words he had spoken before. Steel plates don't move. War doesn't wait for your breathing. She didn't argue. She didn't need to. She knew the battlefield would answer for her. As the weeks dragged on, the training grew harsher. They spent nights in freezing mud, days under blistering sun, crawling through barbed wire, carrying logs as punishment for a single mistake. Sleep became a rare luxury, meals a blur of tasteless rations. More recruits dropped out. Some were injured. Others simply quit, unable to bear the relentless grind. She remained. Her body bore bruises. Her muscles ached, but her mind was unbroken. In the silence between orders, she remembered Montana-long hunts in snow, long days in the Yow. Saddle, long hours waiting for a target to step into view. Compared to that, the mud and the shouting seemed almost easy. The real tests came on the range. They introduced moving targets, wind tunnels, low light conditions. They tested patience, forcing recruits to stay prone for hours, scopes pressed, to eyes waiting for a single fleeting moment of opportunity. It wasn't about pulling the trigger, it was about knowing when not to. Others grew restless, snapping at insects, twitching with discomfort. She lay still. She could wait. She had spent her life waiting for animals to step into view, for the wind to shift, for the earth to align with her breath. Patience wasn't torture for her. It was home. Instructors noticed. Slowly, their skepticism turned to curiosity. By the end of training, she wasn't just surviving. She was excelling. Her name topped scoreboards. Her instructors began to cite her as an example rather than an outlier. The whispers of her peers shifted from mockery to grudging respect. But the colonel remained a shadow over her progress. No matter how many targets fell, no matter how many drills she aced, he withheld judgment. To him, training was still just training. He had seen too many stars on the range falter when the first bullet cracked past their heads in combat. "You're good," he admitted one evening, watching her clean her rifle with meticulous care. "But war isn't clean. It doesn't wait for your breath or your patience. You'll learn that soon enough." She glanced up at him, her face unreadable. "Then I'll learn it, sir." The colonel studied her for a long moment, then shook his head with a low chuckle. "Stubborn," he muttered. "We'll see." What he didn't know was that her entire life had been preparation for the chaos he spoke of. The silence of Montana, the patience of the hunt, the endurance of the ranch, they weren't just lessons. They were armor. And soon the battlefield would give her the chance to prove it. Not just to the colonel, not just to her peers, but to herself. The mountains of Afghanistan rose like jagged teeth against the horizon, their shadows stretching long and sharp across the valley floor. The air was thin here, crisp with dust, and filled with the faint scent of burned fuel and gunpowder. To most soldiers, this landscape felt hostile, suffocating. To her, it felt like another test, the kind of test she had been preparing for her entire life. Their unit had been tasked with sweeping the valley, rooting out an insurgent group that had been ambushing convoys along the main supply road. It was supposed to be routine: secure the ridgeline, push forward, clear the nests. But routine in war was an illusion. It shattered the moment the first crack of gunfire echoed from the cliffs. Bullets kicked up dirt around the column, pinging off rocks, driving men to cover. The valley erupted in chaos, shouts, radio chatter, the dull hump of mortar in the distance. The unit was pinned, caught in the open, and the insurgents were well hidden on high ground. The colonel crouched behind a low outcropping of stone, barking orders into his radio. His jaw was tight, his voice sharp, but beneath the command, a flicker of tension showed in his eyes. He had seen ambushes before. He knew the math of it: high ground plus distance equaled death. She lay prone in the dirt a few yards away, Barrett stretched out before her, scope already raised. While others scrambled for cover, her breathing slowed. Her world narrowed to the glass lens, to the faint silhouettes shifting far above on the ridgeline. "Targets are out of range," a sergeant muttered beside the colonel, frustration in his voice. "We can't hit them from here." The colonel swore under his breath. Artillery was too far out. Air support was delayed. They were boxed in. Then his eyes flicked to her. She was motionless, the Barrett steady in her hands, scope adjusted, dials turning with practiced precision. "You can't possibly," he began. 3200, she murmured, almost to herself. Her finger rested lightly against the trigger. Wind left to right. Drops heavy. The colonel's mouth hung open for half a second before twisting into disbelief. That's impossible. No one's ever. Her breath slowed. Inhale, exhale. The valley around her seemed to disappear. She didn't hear the shouts, the ricochet of bullets, the chaos. She heard only her heartbeat and the whisper of the wind. She squeezed the trigger. The Barrett roared, the recoil slamming back into her shoulder. Dust billowed, the echo rolling across the valley like thunder. Through her scope, she watched. The faint silhouette on the ridgeline jerked and crumpled. Silence. For a moment, it seemed the entire valley had stopped to listen. Then, slowly, the whispers began among the soldiers. No way. Did she? 3,000? The colonel stared, eyes wide, disbelief etched across his face. Confirm, she said calmly into her radio. A spotter further. Down the line responded, voice tight with awe. Confirmed kill. 3200 meters. The colonel blinked, his smirk gone, his skepticism silenced by a single shot. But she didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She adjusted her scope. Again, eyes sweeping the ridgeline. The enemy wasn't gone. One shot didn't end the battle. And the silence that followed wasn't triumph. It was just the breath before the next storm. The insurgents shifted, rattled by the impossibility of the kill. They fired less confidently now, exposing themselves in panic. She took them one by one, each shot a thunderclap that echoed across the valley. Not all were perfect. Some missed. But each shot carried weight, each one pressing the enemy deeper into fear. For the pinned soldiers below, hope returned. Heads lifted, courage rekindled. They weren't trapped anymore. They had range on their side. Now, not just range, but precision beyond imagination. Through it all, she remained calm. Her hands moved with the steadiness of ritual, chambering rounds, adjusting dials, controlling breath. The Barrett kicked and thundered, but she absorbed it, patient, unshaken. Minutes stretched into hours. By the time reinforcements arrived, the insurgents had scattered, their high ground broken by the impossible reach of a single rifle. The valley fell quiet again, dust settling over the rocks and scrub. Soldiers emerged from cover, their faces a mix of exhaustion and awe. The colonel approached her slowly, his boots crunching against gravel. His expression was unreadable shock, pride, maybe even humility, wrestling across his features. You, he paused, words failing him for the first time in years of command. That was impossible. She lowered her rifle, eyes meeting his. Her face was calm, almost serene. No, sir, she said quietly. Just patience. Colonel stared at her for a long moment, and finally, reluctantly, he nodded. It wasn't laughter this time. It was respect. Around them, the soldiers whispered, voices hushed but reverent. The story was already taking root, spreading through the unit like wildfire. A shot at 3,200 meters. A kill at a distance most men wouldn't even attempt. But she didn't care about the whispers. She didn't care about records. She cared only that her unit was alive, that the valley had been held, that the lessons of Montana, the patience of the hunt, the silence of the wait, had once again carried her through. The battle wasn't over. The war wasn't over, but the colonel's laughter was. And in its place, something new had been born, a legend that would follow her for the rest of her life. The valley was quiet, not the tense, suffocating silence of men holding their breath under fire, but the heavy, echoing quiet that follows violence once it burns itself out. Dust still hung in the air, catching the pale Afghan sunlight in golden swirls. The ridgeline where the insurgents had been was still now broken, abandoned. The only sound was the slow shuffle of boots as soldiers began to emerge from cover. They looked dazed, blinking against the sudden absence of bullets, as if their ears couldn't quite believe the war had paused. For hours they had been pinned, like prey, and then, impossibly, the tide had shifted. All because of her. She lay prone a moment longer, cheek pressed against the stock of the Barrett, eyes scanning the ridgeline through her scope. She wasn't hunting anymore. She was making sure the silence was real. Patience had taught her that battles sometimes hid their second breath, that quiet could be a trap. Only when she was certain did she lower the rifle, her muscles moving, with the slow precision of ritual. Around her, men began to murmur. 3,000 meters. Never seen anything like it. Saved our asses? That's for damn sure. The words rippled through the unit, half disbelief, half awe. They weren't speaking to her, most couldn't even bring themselves to, but about her. She could feel their eyes flicking toward her in quick, stolen glances, like she was something dangerous, something otherworldly. She didn't bask in it. She didn't smile. She simply sat back, brushed the dust from her gloves, and began to reload her rifle with steady hands. The colonel approached slowly. His face was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed the storm behind them. For weeks he had watched her with skepticism, waiting for her to falter. He had laughed at her, once mocked her, openly in front of others. Now that laughter felt like something from another lifetime. He stopped a few feet away, boots crunching on gravel. For a long moment, he said nothing. You? His voice was hoarse, as though dragged from deep in his chest. That was impossible. She looked up at him, calm, unshaken. No, sir, just patience. The word struck him harder than any bullet. He stood there, staring, as though he had expected gloating or bravado or even trembling from adrenaline. Instead, he found stillness. The same stillness that had carried her through training, the same stillness he had mistaken for fragility. The colonel had seen many soldiers. After their first true kill, some were shaken, their hands trembling no matter how hard they tried to hide it. Others were exhilarated, grinning with the wild, dangerous energy of survival. But she was neither. She carried the weight with the same quiet strength she had carried the rifle. That unsettled him more than anything. Do you even realize what you've done? He asked finally, his voice low. Her gaze didn't waver. I did my job, sir. The simplicity of the answer silenced him. For the colonel, war had always been complicated strategy, sacrifice, politics, cost. For her, in that moment, it was as simple as breathing. Target, distance, wind, trigger, survival. The other soldiers began gathering near, still whispering among themselves. They had been seconds from disaster, and she had given them another day, another breath. To them, she wasn't just another sniper now. She was something rarer, almost mythical. One of the younger privates, face streaked with dirt and fear, finally spoke what many were thinking. Ma'am, how? At that range, I mean how? She looked at him, her expression softening slightly, though her voice remained calm. Patience, she repeated, and trust. The private nodded slowly, though he didn't fully understand. Few would. As the soldiers regrouped, the colonel moved off to relay their survival up the chain of command. Alone again, she sat beside the Barrett, running her hands over its steel, like a farmer checking the harness of a horse after a long ride. She checked the chamber, the scope, the bipod. Every piece of the weapon mattered. Every piece had done its job. And yet, as she cleaned the dust from the rifle, the silence pressed heavier on her shoulders. Not because of what others thought of her, but because of what only she could hear. She remembered her father's words in the Montana fields. The rifle doesn't shoot. It listens. It had listened today. Listened to her breath, her patience, her calculation. But the silence after, the silence that followed a life taken, was louder than the shot itself. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't guilty, but she was aware. Aware of the weight of what she carried now, not just the weapon, but the number. 3,200 meters. A record, perhaps. A legend, maybe. But to her, it was just distance. A measurement of silence between life and death. Night fell over the valley. The unit dug in, setting a defensive perimeter, preparing for the next move. Around the fires, soldiers spoke in hushed voices, retelling the story already, shaping it into something larger than life. The colonel, usually quick to correct exaggeration, said nothing. He sat quietly, his eyes often flicking toward her across the firelight. For the first time, his laughter was gone. In its place was something heavier, respect tinged with unease. He had doubted her. He had mocked her. Now he was forced to accept that she had achieved what few men in history had ever done. And yet, part of him still wrestled with it. Was it skill? Was it luck? Or was it something else entirely, something he couldn't put into words? She didn't care what he wrestled with. She wasn't here to change his mind. She was here to do her job. When she finally lay down to sleep beneath the endless Afghan stars, the Barrett beside her, the silence returned once more. But this silence was hers. She didn't fear it. She carried it, the way she carried everything else, quietly, patiently, with resolve. And though she didn't know it yet, that silence, the silence after the shot, would follow her for the rest of her life. The war moved forward, as wars always did. One valley was cleared. Another demanded attention. Convoys resumed their slow crawl through the desert roads, the threat never fully gone, only shifting from ridge to ridge. For most soldiers, the ambush. That day became just another chapter in a long string of firefights. But for her, it became something else entirely. The shot didn't vanish into the dust the way others had. It lingered. It clung to whispers and spread through radio chatter, passed from one platoon to another, until the number 3,200 traveled farther than the bullet itself. Within days, it reached headquarters. Within weeks, it became a story whispered across bases, half in awe, half in disbelief. When the colonel called her into his tent, his expression was different from before. He didn't smirk. He didn't dismiss her. He looked as though he had been forced to study her in a way he had never bothered to before. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite his field desk. She obeyed, her back straight, her expression calm. He slid a file across the table. "Do you know what this is?" She glanced at it, saw her name stamped at the top, the official letterhead. Reports, confirmations, eyewitness statements, and attached to it, the beginning of a recommendation. "They want to mark it," the colonel said. His tone was unreadable, part annoyance, part pride, part something darker. "The kill. They want to etch it into record. A badge." She stayed quiet, letting him speak. "You don't understand what that means," he continued, leaning forward. "Most people go their entire careers without something like this. Hell, entire wars pass without shots like that. You made history, whether you wanted to or not." Finally, she spoke. Her voice was calm, even, but there was a steel in it that caught him off guard. "It wasn't history, sir. It was survival." The colonel stared at her for a long time, then leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Maybe for you. But the army, hell. The whole damn country, they'll turn it into something else. They'll make it a symbol. And symbols don't care about truth." 2 weeks later, the ceremony took place. It wasn't grand war, rarely allowed for that. Just a small gathering on a forward operating base. The sound of helicopters in the distance, the smell of sand and diesel in the air. Soldiers formed. A neat line. Boots polished despite the dust. Uniforms crisp under the weight of heat. She stood among them, Barrett polished and strapped to her shoulder, her face as expressionless as ever. To her, it felt unnecessary. She hadn't fired that shot for glory, but the army required rituals, and rituals required recognition. The colonel stepped forward, his voice carrying over the assembly. He spoke of bravery, of precision, of patience. He didn't laugh this time. He didn't question. Instead, he described the ambush, the impossible range, the silence after. His words painted her as something larger than life, the sniper who turned the valley into survival. When he called her forward, she marched with steady steps, boots crunching on the gravel. He held the small box in his hand, the kind reserved for pins and medals. He opened it slowly, revealing the badge inside. At its center was a rifle, etched in fine detail. Below it, numbers were carved into the metal. 3,200 meters. The colonel pinned it to her uniform, the weight of it pressing against her chest. "Wear it with honor," he said softly, just for her ears. She didn't flinch, didn't smile. She simply saluted, then stepped back into line. The applause was brief, almost restrained. Soldiers respected her, but they didn't know how to place her anymore. She was one of them, yes, but also something else. Someone who had seen farther, reached farther than anyone thought possible. That night, she sat alone outside the barracks, the desert air cool against her skin. She touched the badge lightly, with her fingertips. The metal was sharp, the etching rough. Her father's voice returned in memory. "The rifle doesn't shoot. It listens." But what did the badge listen to? What story did it tell? To the army, it told of precision and glory. To the colonel, it told of patience proven. To the soldiers, it told of salvation. To her, it told only of silence. The shot had been necessary. It had saved lives. But the badge did not carry the silence after the silence she alone felt. The heavy truth that every number etched into metal was also a life ended. In the following days, soldiers approached her differently. Some looked at her with respect, some with curiosity, a few with fear. The younger ones asked about the shot, their voices filled with awe. She answered sparingly, never bragging, never embellishing. "Was it luck?" one asked timidly. She looked at him steadily. It was patience. The colonel watched all of this quietly. The badge had changed how the others saw her, but he saw something deeper. He began to seek her out. During planning, asking for her opinion on positions, ranges, possibilities. He didn't admit it, but he trusted her now. And yet, in his eyes, there lingered something else. Unease. The colonel was a man who liked control. He liked knowing his soldiers fit into neat categories: infantry, support, sniper. But she didn't fit. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She was a symbol, a living legend with a badge that carried a story larger than orders. That unsettled him more than any insurgent. Weeks passed, missions continued. She carried the Barrett and the badge into each valley and ridge. The number traveled faster than she did, whispered by men she had never met, admired by those who had only heard echoes of the story. But each night, when she unpinned the badge and set it beside her bunk, she looked at it in silence. Some nights, it gleamed in the dim light, sharp and proud. Other nights, it felt heavy, almost accusing. She knew one truth that the badge never would. Distance was not glory. Distance was only silence measured in meters. And yet, as much as she wrestled with it, she understood something else. The badge wasn't for her. It was for them, for the men who had lived because of her patience, for the army that needed symbols, for the country that needed stories of impossible courage. So she wore it. Not for herself, but for them. When the colonel passed her in the eye. Camp one evening, he paused. His eyes fell to the badge and rose to her face. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. She looked at him, her expression as calm as ever. "No, sir. I remember it." The colonel studied her for a long moment. Then, for the first time, he saluted her not as her superior, but as one soldier to another. The badge gleamed in the fading light, not just metal, but memory. And though she carried it with composure, deep inside she knew it was not the badge that mattered. It was the silence after, the patience before, and the lives it had saved in between. The badge gleamed under desert sunlight, but its shine never reached her eyes. She wore it where regulations demanded, pinned neatly on her chest during briefings, ceremonies, or whenever the colonel paraded her as proof of the impossible. The soldiers glanced at it as though it were some holy relic, a charm that warded off death. Yet at night, when she unpinned it, set it on her knitstand, and stared at it in the stillness, the silence it carried seemed louder than any firefight. The shot had stretched across 3,200 meters of empty air, but its echo stretched even farther. It followed her into dreams. Sometimes she saw the valley, the figure on the ridge, the faint shimmer of heat around him before the Barrett roared. Other times she dreamed not of the man she had killed, but of the silence after so deep, so absolute, as if the earth itself had paused to listen. That silence haunted her more than the kill. On patrols, she remained calm, efficient, her eye pressed to the scope, her breath steady. But when the firefight quieted and the dust settled, she caught herself scanning the ridgelines, not just for threats but for shadows of memory. Her spotter noticed. "You're staring longer these days," he said once, as they sat on an overlook, the Barrett resting between them. She didn't answer immediately. She tracked a dust cloud in the distance, the shimmer of heat rising from the earth. Finally, she said, "I'm listening." The spotter frowned, not understanding. She didn't explain. Back at base, the whispers grew. Soldiers from other units sought her out, wanting to see the woman who had broken distance itself. They asked questions, some respectful, some foolish. What was he doing? Could you even see his face? Was it luck or, skill? Could you do it again? She answered little. Her silence, once mistaken for shyness, had transformed into mystery. To them, she was a legend walking in boots, a story made flesh. But inside, she felt the ground shifting beneath her. Legends weren't people, they were constructs, built from fragments of truth and filled with whatever others needed. The colonel watched this carefully. He had stopped underestimating her long ago, but now even he seemed unsettled by the weight she carried. One evening, after a briefing, he lingered while the others filed out. "You're quieter than usual," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Quieter than usual, sir?" A rare smile flickered across his face. "Fair point. But something's different. You're not just carrying that rifle and that badge, you're carrying something heavier. I can see it." She didn't deny it. She simply met his eyes. "Every shot stays with you. Some just stay longer." The colonel nodded, his jaw tightening. "Make sure it doesn't bury you. Soldiers need symbols, but symbols need to survive." Survival. The word echoed as the days blurred into missions. She moved through villages, mountains, and valleys, the Barrett never far from her grasp. Yet every time she set up her scope, every time she aligned the crosshairs, she thought not of the target, but of the silence that would follow. One mission brought the memory crashing back with brutal clarity. Her team was tasked with covering a convoy, moving through a narrow pass exactly like the one from weeks before. She took her position high on a ridge, the Barrett cradled against her shoulder, her spotter murmuring ranges. Then, across the valley, she saw him. Not the same man couldn't be, but the shape, the stance, the way the figure lifted his rifle. It was as if the past had folded into the present, 3,200 meters collapsing into nothing. Her finger tightened. The memory of that other shot burned in her chest. For a heartbeat, she froze. Target, left ridge. Her spotter barked. She exhaled. The Barrett cracked. The figure dropped. Silence swept the valley. Her hands didn't shake. Her face didn't falter. But inside, the echo deepened. Another life. Another silence etched into her. She wondered how many silences a person could carry before they became heavier than the rifle itself. That night, sleep abandoned her. She lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, the badge glinting on the nightstand beside her. Finally, she rose, slipped outside into the cool desert air, and sat on an overturned crate near the perimeter. The stars stretched endlessly above her, cold and sharp. She remembered her father's words, the lessons on patience, on listening. But his voice had never carried the weight of death. He had taught her to breathe with the rifle, to feel its rhythm. He had not taught her how to live with the echoes afterward. The colonel found her there, though she hadn't heard him approach. His boots crunched softly on gravel. He didn't speak at first, just stood beside her, gazing at the desert. "You did what you had to do," he said at last. She didn't look at him. "I always do. That doesn't mean it leaves." He nodded. Slowly, as though admitting a truth he too carried. "You think too much for a soldier. Maybe," she said quietly. "Or maybe most don't think enough." The colonel gave a rough laugh, then grew serious. "This war will end, sooner or later. But when it does, that shot of yours, it'll follow you home. You better decide what story you're going to let it tell." His words gnawed at her in the following days. What story would it tell? To the army, she was the sniper who rewrote range. To her comrades, she was the quiet shadow who saved lives. To herself, she wasn't sure anymore. During downtime, she began writing in a small notebook. Not official reports, not numbers or mission logs, just fragments. The heat shimmer in the scope, the taste of dust in her mouth, the silence that settled after. She didn't explain, didn't rationalize. She just wrote, as though pinning the memories to paper might lighten the weight they pressed on her. But the shadows didn't vanish. They lingered in the edges of her vision, in the hesitation before each shot, in the way her fingers brushed. The badge as though testing its reality. One evening, as the base prepared for another mission, a younger soldier approached her. He looked barely old enough to shave, his uniform stiff, his rifle too clean. "Ma'am," he said nervously, "how do you do it? How do you pull the trigger at that range? I mean, how do you know you won't miss?" She studied him, saw the eagerness in his eyes, the hunger to learn. For a long moment, she considered answering with talk of wind, distance, mathematics. But then she said, "You don't think about hitting. You think about listening. The rifle knows if you're ready." The young soldier blinked, unsure whether she was serious. She didn't clarify. Some truths couldn't be explained. They had to be lived. But as she walked away, her chest tightened. Because she knew what she hadn't told him. The rifle might listen, but it never spoke back. It never shouldered the silence after. That burden was hers alone. And so, even as she carried the Barrett into new valleys, even as the badge gleamed on her uniform, she knew she was not only fighting enemies across ridges. She was fighting the shadows that followed her shadows of memory, silence and the weight of a single shot that had turned her into something larger than herself. She wore the badge. She carried the rifle. But in the quiet of night, she carried something heavier still, the unending silence of the past. The war was winding down. Or at least, that was what the briefing said. Negotiations hummed in distant rooms. Politicians spoke of withdrawals, and supply flights carried more equipment out than in. Yet on the ground, the mountains did not care. The valleys remained as dangerous as ever. For her, It was not an ending. It was the pause before another breath, the lull before another shot. The Barrett leaned against the wall beside her cot, silent as always. The badge lay on the knitstand, its gleam dulled by a film of dust. She had stopped polishing it weeks ago. It was not neglect, it was acceptance. The metal did not need to shine for its weight to be felt. Orders came down, one final operation. Intelligence had located a high-ranking insurgent commander, a ghost who had evaded capture for years, orchestrating ambushes, bombings, and sniper strikes that claimed countless lives. Eliminating him would not end the war, but it would tilt the balance, give the diplomats leverage. And so, once again, the rifle was placed in her hands as though destiny itself had no imagination for another instrument. She did not argue. She simply checked the weapon, cleaned the chamber, and breathed with the bolt as she had since her father first taught her to steady a rifle. The mission unfolded under a cold dawn. The mountains were gray silhouettes against the sky, sharp as blades. She and her spotter moved silently along a ridge, their boots crunching on loose rock, their breath steaming in the air. The world smelled of dust and iron. The target was expected to appear at a valley outpost, a cluster of stone huts tucked into the terrain like scars. Recon showed he visited irregularly, but today intelligence suggested he would come at sunrise. She settled into position on a rocky overlook, 2,700 meters from the huts. The Barrett stretched before her like a piece of fate. Her spotter adjusted the tripod, his voice steady. Range 2,700. Wind negligible. If he shows, you'll have the shot. She nodded, her eye already to the scope. The valley lay still, shadows clinging to the stones. The minutes stretched. The silence pressed close, familiar and heavy. And then movement. A figure emerging from one of the huts, surrounded by armed escorts. He carried himself with command. Even at distance, the target. Her finger hovered over the trigger. This was why she had been chosen. Not because no one else could shoot, but because she had already done what others thought impossible. She was the legend, the 3,200-meter ghost. Yet as the crosshairs rested on the man's chest, she felt the silence stirring, growing inside her. Another life, another echo. How many silences could one woman carry? Her spotter's voice broke the stillness. You have him. Take it. She inhaled. The world narrowed to the circle of glass, the slow beat of her heart, the weight of metal in her hands. And then she hesitated, not because she doubted the shot, not because she feared missing, but because she suddenly realized this would not be the final reckoning unless she chose what it meant. All her life, the rifle had spoken for her. Her badge had spoken for her. Others had written her story, soldiers, commanders, even the colonel. If she pulled the trigger now, what story would remain? Another silence, another legend, another chapter written by someone else. The man in the crosshairs turned slightly, speaking to his guards. Her finger trembled. She thought of her father's words. Listen, don't just shoot. The rifle knows if you're ready. For the first time, she realized readiness was not about distance or breath. It was about choice. Her spotter's voice grew urgent. What are you waiting for? Take the shot. She exhaled slowly, her eye never leaving the scope. Not yet. Seconds bled away. The target adjusted his headscarf, gestured toward the mountains. Her finger rested on the trigger, but she did not pull. Her spotter swore under his breath. He's going to move. I know. Her voice was calm, steady. The man turned, disappearing back into the hut. The moment was gone. The valley returned to stillness. Her spotter stared at her, disbelief etched on his face. You had him. Do you understand what you just let slip? She lowered the rifle, her hands steady. Yes, I understand exactly, he gaped. Why? She looked at the badge pinned to her chest, then at the mountains beyond. Because I'm done letting this rifle tell my story. The colonel was waiting at base when they returned. His eyes scanned their faces, reading the truth before words were spoken. He escaped, the spotter reported bitterly. The colonel's gaze shifted to her. You had the chance? Yes, and you didn't take it. She met his eyes without flinching. No, sir. Silence stretched, thick and dangerous. The colonel's jaw tightened. He had once laughed at her rifle, and she had proven him wrong. Now, she had defied the expectation that came with it. Finally, he exhaled, his voice low. Do you realize what this means? Command will want answers. Then I'll give them mine, she said simply. He studied her, something unreadable in his expression. At last, he nodded, as though recognizing a battle he could not fight. Very well. But you'd better be ready to live with that choice. She was ready. In the days that followed, whispers spread. Some said she froze. Others said she disobeyed. Rumors grew like weeds, each twisting her silence into something different. But for the first time, she did not care. She no longer needed the legend others crafted. At night, she opened her notebook and wrote. Not fragments this time, but sentences, full thoughts. She wrote about the silence, about the wait, about the choice to hold fire. She wrote about the man in her crosshairs, not as a target, but as a life. She wrote about her father, about patience, about listening. She wrote her story. The badge remained on her uniform, but it no longer defined her. The 3,200-meter shot would always be hers, etched in history. But the refusal, the moment she chose to let the rifle rest, that was hers alone. When her deployment finally ended, she stood on the tarmac, the Barrett crated for return, the desert stretching behind her. Soldiers saluted her, some with admiration, some with confusion, some with bitterness. The colonel gave her a nod, nothing more, but in his eyes there was respect not for the legend, but for the woman who had stepped beyond it. She boarded the plane, the engines roaring. As the ground fell away, she looked out the window at the endless ridges and valleys. The silence followed her still, but it was different now. No longer a weight pressing her down, but a reminder of choice, of control. She had carried the rifle. She had carried the badge. She had carried the silence. But in the end, she had chosen which story to let define her. And that was the true reckoning.